Welcome back to EESC 315. Today we're talking about climate change assessment and adaptation with a guest lecture by Dr. Janya Kelly, Senior Climate Change Specialist with WSP. Dr. Kelly is a climate change and air quality specialist with over a decade of experience in climate change assessment. She completed a postdoctorate at Environment Canada studying the future impacts of climate change on air quality in North America. The published results of her postdoctoral work were referenced in the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Dr. Kelly has been the climate change lead on a number of projects with a primary focus on climate change and adaptation and secondary focus on climate change mitigation through greenhouse gas emission reduction. Dr. Kelly has completed analysis of climate change projections, climate change and greenhouse gas assessments to support permitting and compliance projects, as well as the development of greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Recently, she helped prepare the Mining Association of Canada's Guide on Climate Change Adaptation. In this lecture, Janya will walk us through three different ways that climate change is considered in an environmental impact assessment. First, the effect of climate change on environmental impact predictions. Second, the impact of the project on climate change. And third, the impact of climate change on the project.
Okay, perfect. Well, just to jump in, one of the things that I wanted to do before I get into the meat of everything was tell you a little bit more about my job. So thank you. That was a great introduction. Makes me sound super fancy. I'm a fairly informal person, so please feel free to ask questions as you have them, or we can do them at the end. It's all good. But I wanted to take you a little bit more into what does consulting and climate change, what does that mean? What do you do on a day-to-day basis? So at WSP, I am a climate change specialist, and what I do is I spend most of my time talking to other disciplines and help them support climate change into their studies, planning, and design. And you're going to see how that becomes important in the environmental assessment process in a moment. And we help people look at climate resilience over the life cycle of a project. We develop industry guidance. We look at environmental assessments. The type of things that I've looked at municipal, provincial, federal, and international environmental assessments in all different regions. I've looked at funding requirements for federal and international financial institution programs, corporate policies, risk assessments, all sorts of things. So what I really want to give you an idea of here is what you're studying now can be applied in a whole bunch of exciting ways. And there's a lot of things that still need to be done for climate change, but it's not all in the research realm. There's a lot to be done to make this practical as well. So happy to answer any questions on that a bit later. But what I want to do is really take you on a journey through environmental assessments and climate change and how we do this. So I've broken this into three different sections. The first one, very general, what are we going to look at for where this slots into the process, using the process in BC as an example, but of course, this is very indicative of how it's done across Canada. We also have section 2 where I'm looking at the impact of the project on climate change. So here we're going to talk about greenhouse gases, and then we'll flip and we'll talk about the impact of climate change on the project, which is thinking about how you incorporate climate change through the effects assessment and all through the EIS. So what I'll try and do is pause after each section to gather any questions. And then of course, we can also address anything at the end. So jumping into assessing climate change impacts. I thought I'd start with some of the basic questions. So who needs to do this? It's all the disciplines. No one is exempt. This has been an evolution in the past couple of years. Previously, they just assumed that, okay, one person would kind of write a nice climate change section. We've checked a box, we'll move on. But it really does need to be incorporated by all disciplines. What we're looking at is what I just talked about for sections 2 and 3, the impact of the project on climate change through greenhouse gases and the impact of climate change on the project through climate resilience. When we want to look at this, it's in all stages. It used to be that people would bring climate change in at the end after everything was done. That's not a great idea. It's now throughout the whole process. And where we look at it in terms of an environmental assessment is you'll see portions in the greenhouse gas assessment. You'll see it in effects of the environment, and then you should see it in all the discipline assessment cases. The reason why we're doing this is it's a regulatory requirement. We have to do it as part of the process. But beyond that, there's a lot of stakeholders that are interested in this information and will be requesting it as part of the engagement or as part of their review of the project itself. And how we do this, well, there's guidance. It's not always fulsome, but there is guidance, and the application information requirements will also tell you how you should be considering it as you go through a process. So that's your overall basic questions in terms of what you should be looking at. But what I wanted to do was grab one of the graphics from the BC policy and just show you with these red circles, where do we slot into the process? So we come in at the very beginning. Climate change is one of the disciplines that you can kick off very early on as part of your initial project description and your detailed project description. And then we come in with everyone else as part of the draft application, final application, and assessment report. However, there's some caveats in there about information going back and forth, because for some people to complete their effects assessment, they may need climate projections, and those may need to be developed earlier on, either through the detailed project description or as one of the beginning disciplines as part of the effects assessment. So it's just a lot of planning around figuring out who needs what information when. When I talk about the early engagement and the initial project description, there's a few things that are expected. We're not doing the whole thing right now. What we're doing is giving the reviewers an idea of how you're thinking about climate change. So do you know your sources of emissions? Do you have an idea of how you want to mitigate those emissions and reduce them? Have you thought about this in terms of all your alternatives analysis that you've completed up to this point? So it's not necessarily a complete and detailed inventory, but just demonstrating that you have a handle on what's happening in the project. When we talk about the climate resilience, we're giving an overview of the potential effects of the natural hazards or how climate can interact with the project. And at this point in BC, they suggest that you want to provide a list of questions to consider. So what are you going to be asking going forward? And you also want to focus on understanding potential impacts of extreme events and frequency and intensity and how these may change over time. So it's again demonstrating your understanding that climate change will interact with the project and that you have a plan for how you're going to think about this as part of the project. When we get to a detailed project description, there's some general requirements. So of course, you want to build on what you've already provided. And if you have any changes, you should provide justification for those changes or how engagement really stimulated those changes. For greenhouse gases, now you're getting more detailed in your emission estimates. You're talking about direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions by phase, which I'll provide examples of those. But you're also talking about, now that you understand what the potential emissions are for the project, you have a detailed project description, you also need to think about how does this project impact a province or territory being able to meet its GHG targets. For climate resilience, here you need to talk about how you've thought about Indigenous and local knowledge and how you incorporated that into effects assessment on the project. So now that you've had a little bit of engagement and you've gathered that information, how are you going to bring that into the project? So again, you're constantly showing a deeper understanding of how climate change is being brought in. When we get to the effects assessment stage, now things get more detailed. So in BC, there is a requirement that all the proponents need to provide sufficient information, and you're required to demonstrate what the project's emissions are and how they may affect the provincial GHG reduction targets. So pretty straightforward, builds on the detailed project description. Within the effects assessment policy, greenhouse gas is separated out a little bit from the VC framework. Sometimes this is because we behave like a valued component, but how we go about our assessment is a little bit different. We don't quite fit the mold. You can approach, the approach that you choose to estimate your greenhouse gas emissions and develop your inventory can be scaled to the type of projects that you're doing. And I'll get into that a bit more later. Looking at the Site C dam. And you also want to look preferentially at the provincial methods, but if the provincial methods don't give you the emissions guidance that you need, you can go out to federal methods or other industry standard methods. And then you also need to consider current and announced policies and legislation. So it's not just thinking about what is valid now, it's what's coming into play in the next couple of years. Where do they see this progressing into the future? So it's again demonstrating not only that you're good for operation right now, but over the lifetime of the project, that you can continue to operate in a manner that will have minimized impacts. When we talk about climate resilience in terms of the effects assessment, we need to look at the existing conditions. And so over that baseline period, how have things been changing? And how can that impact any of the valued components? In the cumulative effects assessment, you want to look at both the current and the future projected conditions. And there is guidance available from BC for how you should do all of this. And you also need to look at the effects of the environment on the project and how climate change can modify any project risks and what mitigation measures are being considered to minimize those impacts. So there's a bunch of different places where you'll see climate resiliency come through. It's more of a consistent thread throughout the entire assessment itself. So that's a high-level overview. And what I'd like to do is get into a table right now, which has a lot of words in it. So we're not going to read all of them. It's just showing you what the difference is between the federal and the provincial. And the reason this is important is when you're looking at an environmental assessment, sometimes it can get designated up to the federal level, and the federal assessment process has more requirements. And those have just come out since 2020. And there's even more draft technical guidance that has come out just in 2021 to help guide a more fulsome assessment of greenhouse gases and climate resilience to allow Canada to continue to meet its targets. So when we're talking about a federal versus provincial, when you're estimating your greenhouse gases, everything is pretty much on par. The biggest difference is federal would like you to show every single year. You don't necessarily have to do that for provincial. Sometimes you look at the maximum year. You can consider emission intensity under the provincial. It's required under federal, but there's a challenge there because you don't always have a benchmark to compare it to. So sometimes you're just saying what an intensity is with no context really of comparison. The federal level wants you to talk about greenhouse gases in terms of accidents and malfunctions, but the guidance currently does not require that at the BC provincial level. But the federal does want you to look at carbon sinks. And again, it may be considered under the provincial, but it may not be. And that could again be scaled according to the type of projects. When you start to look at the ability to reduce emissions at a federal level or a global level, both of them want you to look at the impacts on targets. When you talk about the mitigation measures to help reduce the emissions, the requirements under the federal process are much more detailed. It's a much bigger exercise to do the best available technology, best environmental practice determination, because you're doing that across multiple categories, not just the emissions reductions, the environmental side. Provincially, you're looking at alternative means and mitigation measures. You don't have to go into all of, say, the cost analysis or like a social impact. You may be required to do an upstream emissions at a provincial level, but again, under the federal level, you have to if you are likely to hit a threshold associated with the year of the project. And then now we're starting to talk a little bit more about the application of the BAT-BEP determination in terms of a net zero plan. And the net zero plan isn't required at a provincial level. It is if you're operating beyond 2050 at a federal level. And then your description of how you're going to get to the net zero, you need to include that in your net zero plan, because you have to get back to zero. But within the provincial level, you can identify any offset or carbon capture and storage options. So again, those ones are reasonably equivalent. So you're following a lot of the same process. You're following a lot of the same information. The level of detail that you're required to provide and the justification is much higher on the federal side. And then finally, when you're talking about resilience, a lot of them are very comparable. Federal specifies mean and extreme, but extreme comes up early on in the process for the provincial assessment. So they're pretty equivalent. So I can take a pause there because that's been a huge dump of information on the general process, and just see if anybody has any questions at this point.
I'm just looking around online and in the room. So far, you are good to keep going.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so let's jump into the world of GHGs. GHGs are one of the easiest disciplines because it's predominantly math. It's one of the hardest disciplines because there is a lot of nuanced arguments and justifications that you have to make because we don't fit the mold. So when I talk about greenhouse gases, I thought I'd just take a step back, and I apologize if this is a repeat of earlier lectures, but greenhouse gas emissions are divided into 3 different scopes. Your first scope is your direct emissions. These are owned and controlled by the company. You are making the decision to burn the fuel. You are clearing the land, any of that kind of stuff. So it's stuff that you have direct control over. Your scope 2 is your indirect emissions, but here it's specifically the emissions from purchased electricity, heat, or steam consumed by the company. And then scope 3 is everything else that is a consequence of your actions, but it's not owned or controlled by the company. So you're building something out of cement. The GHGs associated with producing that cement would be under scope 3. It's a consequence of your action of building that the cement may have been made. So it's just understanding where do the different actions fall into. And when we talk about an environmental assessment, currently we're just looking at scopes 1 and 2. Scopes 3 tend not to be involved, although any company can put that in. It's the guidance around estimating those is still being developed in a lot of areas, and they can be very challenging to completely identify. So you'll hear about those more in maybe a net zero framework for a corporate level or like targets. So you will hear those words come up, not as much in the environmental assessment side of things. What does this look like? I've just taken this graphic from the GHG protocol just to give you an idea of where the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions can come from, just various sources. And then as well, they've shown the 6 gases that are generally associated at the top in the clouds. For most environmental assessments, you're talking about the big 3, which is the CO2, CH4, and N2O. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. So you can look at those ones. You only get the HFCs and the PFCs if you have a lot of chilling or potentially some air conditioning, refrigeration. And FS6 doesn't come up that often, but it can be if you have transformers associated with electricity. But those are more uncommon to see in an assessment. And then the other area, which wasn't shown as much on that graphic, is the idea of carbon sinks. So when you're looking at a site and you want to put a project on there, you have to have an understanding of what sort of carbon storage is available on the site. So a carbon sink is the ability of a forest or an ocean or any other natural environment to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If the presence of your project impacts this carbon sink, you need to account for that as part of your inventory. And the impact can be positive or negative. It's usually negative because you tend to be removing the vegetation. You do have opportunities, especially during a closure phase, to do some sort of restoration or reclamation of ecosystems, or maybe you're bringing in some natural infrastructure that's going to help with that. That can actually create a positive carbon sink because you're enhancing it. So that's something you can get credit for as part of your inventory. The amount of carbon can vary depending on the ecosystem type, and they do need to be considered individually. So whether you're looking at a stand of trees or whether you're looking at wetlands, you have very different carbon amounts that may be stored with that. And with trees, if you go and burn the trees, well, then that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. And so that would be like a one-time loss of the carbon. But you can also think of whether those trees are merchantable and whether you can sell them. And if you can keep that carbon stored in the timber, then again, you don't have to account for that loss. The thing you do have to remember, though, is those trees aren't there anymore. And so the amount that they would absorb every year, the ongoing loss, that does need to be accounted for. So there is guidance developed around this. This is a great time to make friends with your vegetation team to get a better understanding of what they're seeing out there. So this is a time where you want to look at the two disciplines together. Where should you look at including your GHG emissions when you're doing your assessment? You need, as I mentioned earlier, the alternate means of carrying out the project. So when you are considering different alternate routes, whether you're considering different equipment, you want to look for ones that have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions associated with them that are reasonably possible. So maybe you're picking a highway route that's not going through a wetland. Maybe you're picking a route for a pipeline that's shorter. Things like that to look at in terms of the alternate means. And there's a number of different ways that you can do it. But again, it's just making and documenting that informed decision. And then we have it under the impact assessment where that needs to be assessed. So you're going to look at what aspects are being dictated by the regulations, what jurisdiction are you in, what does your application information requirements or your terms of reference say about what you need to consider. And the thing to note is that the approach is really continuing to evolve as we get more and more announcements of emission reduction targets, transitions to low carbon economy, what is important in terms of a corporate strategy of a company implementing the project. These are all things that are starting to impact it's a horrible word. They're trying to influence what's happening with these impact assessments, especially as the public becomes more engaged and educated on the topic. When we want to assess a greenhouse gas, we've got to start defining a couple of things. So what are the rules you're going to play by when you're doing your assessment? The first thing you want to define is your greenhouse gas as a valued component. Previously, it's been indicated as a secondary component. That's a little bit more challenging because the information is not really passed on to anyone else to use. It's just there. So it's better just to put it forward as a valued component and look at it in terms of its socioeconomic and cultural importance. So it's impacting how people live and work, but then there's also the impact on the federal and provincial targets. And some of the drivers for identifying it as a value component are also going to come into play when we get to the assessment endpoints. Now, the next thing you want to look at is measurement indicators. So once you know it's a value component, how are you going to measure it? That one's fairly easy for greenhouse gases. You just want to measure your emissions and you decide which gases you're going to look at based on the sources. When you're talking about your assessment endpoints, this is what you'll be measuring the GHG emissions against to assess the significance. So typically what we look at is the contribution to emissions and the ability to reach reduction targets. One of the challenges with greenhouse gas emissions, say, compared to air quality, is air quality tends to have very short-lived just standards that you have to meet. So like 1 hour thresholds you can't cross, annual values, all sorts of things like that. The standards that you have to compare to meet to maintain the quality of the air. For greenhouse gases, we don't have that upper limit as much. So what you end up comparing to is the existing inventories and our ability to meet everything that's been put in place in terms of targets and policies and regulatory programs. One of the other challenges is defining boundaries. If you are counting salamanders, you want to know the size of the box that your salamanders fit in. You don't want to count the salamanders outside of the box. You just want to be the ones you're responsible for. Greenhouse gases don't care about your box. They're very global. They're very long-lived. They get into the atmosphere. They move all around. It is very challenging to look at the impact of one project. So for this reason, we do tend to define them spatially as global, which is unlike all Most of the disciplines, we don't have study areas, but we do use an administrative boundary for our inventories, and that you want to dictate according to the regulations and policies, like how you need to calculate your emissions. From a temporal side of things, you want to look at all phases of the project, not just operations, which back in the day was what people would look at. And then you want to think about what sources of greenhouse gas emissions you're going to have during the different phases, and what point will they be occurring. So what is their operation schedule? Is it all the time? Is it not? You want to have a reasonably conservative assessment, but not ridiculously conservative, so everything's on all the time. Once you know how you're going to define everything, how you're going to calculate it, what your rules are, now you can look at your assessment cases. So your assessment cases demonstrate the impact of the project within the context of the existing conditions, any previous existing projects or planned projects. So it's really, again, getting back to, can you operate now without a huge impact? Can you operate in the future? Can you continue to operate? GHG emissions tend to need a bit more special consideration because the way that assessment cases are set up, typically in an environmental assessment, don't work well. Part of this is because our existing conditions are typically defined by federal and provincial or territorial GHG inventories, and these already include previous and existing projects. And then the planned projects, which we wouldn't necessarily have emissions for and would be hard to gauge how they're going to impact, it's really understanding what are the planned regulatory programs and emission reduction targets, because any new project that would be coming in would have to be following the same regulatory programs. So we have to define our cases a little bit different, but our cases are always tied to the assessment endpoints. And you have to consider that, what your cases might be when you're selecting your assessment endpoint. So everything comes together in a very clear, clean storyline for the reviewer. Once you have an idea of what your assessment cases are and all of your activities, and how all of the GHG emissions are going to come or result from all the phases, you want to think about how you want to organize that information and present it so it makes sense. So are you talking about all your stationary combustion in one area, all your mobiles in another, just so it's, again, clean, well documented. Once you have that, you can identify your mitigation measures that have been as part of the project to reduce GHG emissions. These are often very similar to the ones for air quality. So again, here's a great point to talk to another discipline and see what they're doing to create that consistent storyline. You may want to look at project design features. So is there a renewable energy source instead of, say, a diesel generator? When you're looking at your trucks, have you picked ones with emission control devices? You may want to look at planning, so the regular maintenance or strategy. Is there a way that new technologies are going to be brought in over time to help reduce the emissions? So again, it's looking at a long stretch of time and how you can continue to operate. And those pieces all come together by looking at the net GHG emissions for each phase. So that's your direct, indirect, plus your mitigation measures. Do you have any carbon sequestration or offset purchases or avoided domestic GHG emissions at a federal level? So this might be like a carbon leakage situation. What information do you have? This forms your measurement indicators. And once you have those, you can compare them to your assessment endpoints. And your assessment cases, of course, are going to support your comparison, and they're going to be used to assign a significance. When we talk about assigning significance, again, greenhouse gases don't fit the mold. So typically when we're looking at a significance assessment, we come up with a number of criteria or criterion that we want to look at for significance. So direction, magnitude, geographic extent, duration, reversibility, frequency, probability of occurrence. These are all different characteristics that are very well defined and flexible for a lot of other disciplines. The industry standard now within greenhouse gases is that the direction is negative. There's very much an adverse effect unless you are not emitting anything or you're somehow having a negative like a net negative, it's going to be an adverse effect as a VC. The magnitude, well, you're going to develop a scale for the project. The geographic extent, well, that's beyond regional. It's that global level we were talking about. We consider the duration of greenhouse gases to be permanent because of the long lifetime of the greenhouse gases. So once they're up there for a while. The reversibility, we consider it now irreversible because it lasts well beyond when the emissions cease. So even if you were to cease the emissions now, the impact of having those GHGs in the air is still long-lived. Continuous, they're being emitted almost always, and your probability of occurrence is certain. And one thing to note about the magnitude is that the magnitude rating is developed based on precedents from previous projects. There's no actual fixed guidance currently available. So that's something that becomes a bit more of a challenge because you have to come up with something that is reasonably defensible. One of the things that you might want to look at is understanding what is the error or the uncertainty associated with the provincial and the federal emissions inventories that you're using for your existing conditions. How does that compare?
Can I just stay on that point for a minute?
Yep.
If you scroll back one slide. So I mentioned, so in this course, we're going to do significance. We haven't done that yet, but I've mentioned before, we're going to go through all of these things in a lot of detail. But just to kind of recap what Janya just talked about here. So the only one that we can really differentiate here with greenhouse gases is the magnitude. The rest are sort of fixed for that particular assessment. But the key point here is that the magnitude is based on precedents. It's not based on a certain level of harm, like it might be for, say, an air quality constituent like nitrous oxide or something where we have threshold values. There is no like health-based value or sort of a fixed level of harm that some project is, supposed to stay below. It's really just kind of based on what's been approved or not approved or acceptable or not acceptable in other settings. Is that fair to say, or is there another way to that?
No, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and it's a little different from all the other components where we normally have some sort of level of either some health-based threshold or some area-based or some other level of tolerance. So it's a tricky one for greenhouse gases because there is no set level that a certain project is deemed to be acceptable or not acceptable based on some really objective criteria.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And it is unusual compared to the other components or disciplines, but thankfully there hasn't been a lot of argument between the different environmental assessments because these things are available and published. It is easy to check to see what's been done previously. You just have to be careful not to go too far back. As I mentioned at the beginning, the process for this has evolved quite a bit, even going from what was done for Site CDAM versus what's sometimes done today. So when we look at the next steps, so you've got everything together in your effects assessment. What else can you do coming out of the environmental assessment? Well, when you're putting together your inventory, there are a number of assumptions that you're going to make. There can be uncertainties associated with your estimates. How do you deal with that? Well, moving forward, you can look at compliance monitoring, so what you're required to do. Follow-up monitoring, so do you want to confirm that an emission factor is correct? So you can do some modeling of that. You can do some monitoring and measurement. You can do adaptive management. So can you incorporate this concept of greenhouse gas emissions into continual improvement and when decisions around greenhouse gases need to be made? So that might be more exemplified in a net zero plan. Most monitoring of the greenhouse gas emissions is relating to participating in relevant regulatory programs, which is just a fancy way of saying reporting your emissions every year. So that's required to do. You look at the provincial guidance, federal guidance, follow the rules. And then you may also consider GHGs under different management plans developed for the project as well. So again, there's a certain amount that you can do as the effects assessment. That's where most of it is, but it can extend outside of the environmental assessment itself. So that's something else that you may see as part of the decision coming out of it, is what is required to do as a next step. And then I wanted to spend a bit of time, and not too much, but the Site C dam case study, I wanted to talk a little bit about the greenhouse gases and how they were treated here. So should you want to read through it, section 15 of volume 2, it follows the anticipated process. There's no real surprises there. It provides the expected documentation to support the effects assessment. But the focus of the assessment is the land use changes associated with the project because of the complex interactions of the reservoir. So this is well beyond what would normally be considered for carbon sink loss in a typical project. So this, again, is a great example of something that's been scaled to the purpose of the project. So they've sat down, thought about, where are my greenhouse gases going to be emitted? Where are these interactions going to be happening? And how do I capture those in a reasonably defensible manner? And because of the complexities, the standard emission factor way of saying, oh, I've cleared 5 hectares and I'm going to multiply it by this kind of trees for the carbon storage to get my greenhouse gases is not going to work. So that is a really interesting way of seeing how that was put together. The baseline conditions, they looked at the carbon mass balance to capture the important local changes in addition to the provincial and federal thresholds. So again, understanding the specific context of this project and what was most appropriate. They do provide a life cycle assessment of the construction materials as part of the construction emissions. Again, not strictly required, but good information to have. It's above and beyond what's needed. But this is more in line with what you'd see in an upstream assessment. So again, if this is of value either through engagement or through the corporate strategy of the person implementing the project, you may see some of these above and beyonds coming in. And the characterization of the effects has evolved in the more recent assessments. So more, as we just discussed, the more recent assessments focus only on the magnitude, treating the other ones as fixed. Here they've considered all of them, but with the most notable change is that they feel the emissions are reversible. So again, it's an interesting read to go through to see how things have evolved and changed over time.
Question, when would you require an upstream assessment?
Oh, well,
Maybe we should mention what an upstream assessment is. I'm not sure if
it's right there. You're right on time.
There we go.
Perfect. I wanted to touch a little bit back on these federal projects again, because you will hear these words come up. And even if you're not doing a federal project, the public will ask for aspects of them. And that's okay. They're allowed to ask. So I did mention a BAT-BEP determination earlier. Best available technology, best environmental practice, takes almost as long to do one as it does to say the title. You have to document how the project is going to minimize GHG emissions. And this is considering the technical and the economical feasibility. You have to review all the available technologies. There's a lot of documentation that goes with this. You can also consider additional considerations. So like if you want to look at, like you're really close to a community, then you want to look at that social impacts. You want to look at that stakeholder engagement side of things. There are a number of different things that may be material to your company or important. Those are things you want to bring into it. And then you have to provide a rationale for eliminating an option. So you have to go through and demonstrate to the government that you didn't just, pick one out of a hat, that you've had a very thoughtful process to go through to arrive at why you can only use this option. So why do you need to run a diesel generator instead of having some solar power instead? Why does that not work in this case? Is it because of your location? Is it because of the consistency? Like, what is the idea behind that? So that's what that process is doing. We see aspects of that when we talk about the mitigation measures, but it's not as fulsome. The upstream assessment So what we just talked about, this is where you want to understand everything that was on the far left of the diagram I showed. So what is coming into the project? All of the extra materials you're requiring, getting stuff to site, everything you're using. You're required to do one when you think that your project's upstream emissions, so if you calculated, say, all the emissions associated with making the concrete, are likely to be above a provided threshold. And this threshold is reasonably high for projects starting right now. And over time, it goes down. And the driver for this is creating a pathway for proponents to have a better consideration of the whole life cycle aspect of their project as we move closer and closer towards Canada's net zero commitments and their targets. So when you do an upstream assessment, there's two portions. The first half is a quantitative estimate of the project's upstream emissions. So what do you think they are? And it's not just that, you have to bring in an element of cost associated with them. So you understand what the cost is for every ton of carbon equivalent that you have coming into this. Part B is a qualitative discussion. So here you look at the conditions where the upstream emissions could occur in the absence of the project. So just because you need to build something with concrete doesn't mean that's necessarily the only reason that concrete would exist. Is it possible that that site was making it anyways for another purpose, so you're just utilizing it? It's just understanding and putting the project into context of what upstream emissions are you creating that are solely due to your project and can only be attributed to that. They're very unique. And which ones could be attributed to multiple different projects. And if your project's not going to use it, somebody else will. So again, that's just understanding the beginning. The amount of upstream emissions you have, of course, depend where you are in a production process. So for example, if you were looking at developing a battery and you wanted to make all sorts of batteries in a factory, you might have to consider all of the metals coming in to look at that. Well, if you're a mine, you may not have the same considerations because you're at the point of that extraction. So where are you in the whole processing set of where we get our materials from? Are you smelting them? Are you extracting them? What are you doing with them? So it's, again, just creating that picture. Then the other side of it is, okay, we get to the actual project being in place. We have a net zero plan. And again, here you only do it if your project lifetime goes beyond 2050. If your project ends in 2045, you're going to be at zero in 2050. It's not hard math. But you have to develop a credible plan to describe how your project will achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and how this will impact Canada's net zero goal. So it's not just in isolation, it's what are you doing for yourself and what are you doing to contribute to Canada. You want to describe the technologies and the decision-making process to achieve this. This is highly tied to the BAT-BEP determination. You're going to reuse a lot of that information. And then you also have to tell them, like, every, say, 5 years, what are your reductions? So you can't just say, oh yeah, no, we'll get there. You have to show them a reasonable map of how you think it's going to proceed over time. So that, again, helps a reviewer at a federal level make an informed decision of not only what is the impact of your project itself, what other GHGs emissions are they going to create because of your project, so the upstream, and then how are we going to mitigate that so we can still achieve Canada's goals, which is your net zero plan. So it's that starting from the very beginning to the end, how does this all work together? So the key messages when we're talking about GHG emissions is that you do need to consider them during early engagement and your effects assessment. Your guidance is being determined by your jurisdiction, and your federal guidance has additional requirements. A defensible GHG emissions inventory is the key to a strong effects assessment. So following required quantification approaches is important. Justify why different approaches might be needed, and document all of your assumptions and your uncertainties. We can't quantify the impact of only one project on a global scale. So the assessment endpoints need to be meaningful to the regulatory reviewers. So we have to be careful about how we're coming up with those assessment endpoints, as we discussed. The GHG assessment approach will continue to evolve as we learn more and more about climate, and climate science evolves on both sides of resilience and mitigation. So you do have to always be aware of what is happening in the space and how guidance might be changing. So I'll pause there again before jumping into the resilience side of things in case anybody has any questions on greenhouse gases.
I don't see any in the room here. I'll just quickly check everyone online, but I think you're good to keep going.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to flip the coin and go to the other side of climate resilience. And this is going to be a little bit of a different discussion. So you'll notice that we're going to be discussing different pieces associated with it. It's not as cut and dried and linear and very well organized that GHGs are. So one of the things I like to tell people is assessing climate change is like getting dressed. We all do it, but we all do it a little bit differently. And we do it for the purposes of what we're doing that day or where we're going or where we are. So it is a very dynamic science in that sense, is that you're always doing it that's fit for purpose. One of the ways we do this is by building connections. Climate resilience can't be assessed in isolation. It's very important to build connections with other disciplines early in the project so you can understand what their climate data needs are. So as part of climate resilience, we often can develop a data set. You want to make sure that that is supporting as many disciplines as possible. And that creates consistency. What we have seen in the past is you have a nice climate section that talks about all these climate projections, and then I'll pick on surface water. Surface water will go and develop their own projections, and now you've put something in front of the reviewer that has two different climate projections. And that is something that can cause people to ask some questions about the consistency of the report. One of the other aspects that often gets overlooked and is something that's newly evolving, especially with the updated guidance, which is a strategic assessment on climate change, is the concept of Indigenous and local knowledge. So when you're gathering this information and when the stakeholder engagement is happening, often questions are asked in a way that's not meaningful. So you don't gather any information related to climate change. We need to help the EA teams. We need to work to build a list of meaningful questions for engagement specialists to use during their sessions. And we need to consider whether any of the surrounding stakeholders have made any commitments or statements or anything related to climate change to help guide your question development. But one of the biggest things you can do to make it meaningful is to put it in terms of the surrounding communities. So when you're talking about the timelines of climate change, you're not going to use science words like midterm and end of century. You're going to say, is this something that has been experienced within an elder's lifetime, or has this been experienced within a youth's lifetime in the community? It's just changing your focus to be more community-centric. And you want to relate changes in climate to changes in community activities. So asking somebody whether or not they've noticed that a 1 in 50-year storm has happened more often may not be meaningful. But if you ask whether or not you can continue with a foraging activity because there's more or less flooding, may give you an indication of what's happening. So it's just a different way to think about how you're engaging and asking about the information. When we talk about a data set development, what you're going to look at to support your resilience assessment, there is limited guidance available for developing climate data sets, but there is a lot of industry standards and best practices associated with this. One of the number one rules, though, is that it should fit the purpose and level of detail for the project. So you have to, again, think about the context in which it's going to be used. You want to consider the most current climate science. So right now we have the 6th assessment report from IPCC. Whenever you can use that, that's great. You don't want to use the 4th assessment report that is now superseded, but not all climate portals are providing information for the 6th assessment report. So you may be able to rely on the 5th assessment report, but provide justification for why that's okay. So again, it's documenting and transparency. You can't use climate data portals blindly. There's a lot of them out there. They provide lovely graphics. They provide a lot of lovely information. And I won't go too much into this because I don't want to steal the thunder of next week's lecture or the next lecture, but you need to understand the limitations and the uncertainty associated with any information that you're using. And you need to understand how any climate information presented was analyzed, because you want to make sure that it is supporting what you think it is and that it's saying what you think it is. And again, transparent documentation, I cannot say that enough. That is one of the keys to building a robust data set and coming back and having it be defensible. When I talk about some of the challenges associated with doing a climate change projection, well, there's a few. Many disciplines have to look at a description of local and regional climate to support their existing conditions, including future conditions. But the current conditions may be described very differently. So when we look at current conditions under a climate discipline or under the climate resiliency, we're looking at climate data sets over long term, so averages of 20 years or more. Disciplines may require observations or modeling that aren't available on that time scale, and they may be using slightly different stations or slightly different information. So for example, air quality dispersion modeling uses a 5-year data set typically, and you need to have winds, you need to have all sorts of hourly information in order to drive the models. That level of information may not be required by the climate data set, and we may end up using 2 different stations. So one of the ways to get around that is, again, to provide that justification for the fit for purpose for the air quality modeling, but also to put the information in the context of what's been said in the climate data set. And again, that's discussion with other disciplines and just making sure everybody's going the same direction. Future projections should come from a consistent data set if possible across all disciplines. And this, again, requires early discussion and planning to avoid duplicate efforts. When we look at the effects of the environment, we want to look at how the environment is anticipated to change. So we want to describe environmental factors that may have consequences on the project and how they may change under future climate conditions. And we also want to quantitatively assess them by assigning a likelihood and consequence of the changes or effect. And the other thing we need to look at is how the project has considered the environment. So how has climate and climate change already been incorporated into project design and planning? So this can be just considering certain design storms and design parameters. When you're looking at like the Site C dam, they would have had to have looked at certain conditions that would influence the design itself. We also want to look at mitigation measures to minimize negative effects of environment. So again, these are design strategies, risk plans, everything else to just, again, consider that interaction. Project risks and environmental factors will often be identified through the different discipline effects assessments, as these are the different areas where they are the subject matter experts. So you're not, you want to look for consistency between the effects of the environment section and the different disciplines, but also has all of that information been brought together. So if there is an impact on a species because the water is going to get warmer and now that fish can't spawn anymore, that's going to be something that you want to see reflected in the effects of the environment section. So again, just consistency across the whole storyline. And when we look in the effects of the environment, we start talking about that resilience assessment. This is again identifying how these hazards and events are likely to interact with both the activities and the infrastructure, and how are we reducing that risk over time. So the likelihood and consequence, there's usually ranking scales. These ranking scales for likelihood and consequence may be provided by guidance. So if you're relying on external guidance, so the strategic assessment for climate change at a federal level does recommend looking at the process in the climate lens assessment, which does provide ranking scales, or you may have some that are developed for the project as part of their own risk management systems. The likelihood should consider current and future events to show how the risk is changing over time, and consequence should consider more than just the environmental impacts. And this is especially in BC. So you're not just looking at is there an environmental impact or not? Is there a reputational impact? Is there a cost associated with this? There's a number of categories you can look at, and they're outlined in the BC guidance. And you want to look at risk, which is likelihood times consequence equals risk. So you get your total score, and then you want to look at, say, how can you reduce that risk from the mitigation measures? So does that reduce the likelihood associated with it? So the process for climate resilience assessment is fairly well developed. There's a number of different sources that you can look at for it, which I've outlined here. So the Strategic Climate Risk Assessment Framework for British Columbia, so that's where they do provide a bit more on the consequence across different categories. The Strategic Assessment of Climate Change, they do have very high level information. There is technical guidance that is currently under development. We're all eagerly awaiting it. It has not appeared yet. The Climate Lens General Guidance, which I just mentioned, it's developed by Infrastructure Canada. It's used to assess funding for a number of different projects that are demonstrating themselves to be more green. And then the one that was mentioned at the very beginning from the Mining Association of Canada that I was a part of developing is the Guide to Climate Change Adaptation for the Mining Sector. I believe that is the first step of a 3-step process, is to understand what your risk is associated there. So there's a number of different resources to get your hands into what a resilience assessment is going to look like. And one of the other things that comes out of the Mining Assessment, or the Mining Association of Canada guidance, is the idea of adaptive management plans and climate adaptation frameworks. And so what this does is, you've done this great resilience assessment, and that's great, but just like we talked about next steps for the greenhouse gases, what are some of the next steps that you can take for climate resilience inside of an environmental assessment? And then again, this is an above and beyond. It's not something that's required yet, but we may see that evolution over time. And what we're trying to do with an adaptation framework is to look at how we can develop a decision-making framework around project risks to integrate this into part of the continual improvement and the planning and the permitting and all of the steps that come after an environmental assessment, because so this becomes part of the natural living process of the project. What can happen sometimes when you're looking at climate assessments, or especially the resilience side of things? Things are much more developed for greenhouse gases than they are for the resilience. It's still coming up to more common knowledge and popularity. So it can be something that is assessed and then kind of lives on a shelf and nobody ever goes back to it. So part of this process that's being implemented within the mining sector and is fully applicable to many other sectors is a way to take all of that great work you've just done and recreate an easy process to think about it outside of the environmental assessment. How are they embodying this? How are they embodying climate resilience going forward throughout all stages of the process? And when we look at that, again, we have challenges associated with climate resilience. So it is documented under the effects of the environment section, but it's linked to many other sections within the projects and within the effects assessment. So it can be things in terms of the project description, the discipline section. So this can make it very challenging for reviewers to fully understand where everything has been considered and how has that been all documented. You need to plan for the effort for someone to compile and consider all the identified project risks before you do your resilience assessment. It's not that it's all necessarily just going to be right there in an obvious way, because not all disciplines may clearly document their considerations or consider it the same way. Some are going to be qualitative, some are going to be quantitative. There is limited future projections for some climate variables, which can impact likelihood scoring. So if you were very worried about tornadoes, it is hard to find future projections of tornadoes. So that's something just to be aware of. And the project design itself may not be far enough along to provide detailed design or mitigation information, which can impact your consequence scoring. So again, it comes down to that transparent documentation and making sure all of your assumptions are well-founded and clear. So when I go back and I look at the Site C dam case study, which the climate change is documented in section 37 of volume 5, it does document climate hazards and events and plan mitigation measures for each project component. So that's great. But it only really documents 2 potential effects of climate change on the project, which I found very interesting after having multiple climate hazards earlier on. The climate change projections themselves are in Appendix T of Volume 2, which is not unusual for it to be in a slightly different location. But they've really just focused in on climate change on stream flow, which given the project isn't surprising. But it's interesting that they have not considered all of the climate hazards and events that have been identified under the effects of the environment, and they have not really discussed why. So again, when you're looking and you're reviewing an environmental assessment, that might be a bit of a disconnect. They may be deemed not to be significant, and that could be okay, but it's just good to write that down. The characterization of the climate change has evolved since this assessment to consider climate resilience. So here they've only really provided that climate projection. So what I talked about at the beginning, they have not really considered climate risk. So assigning likelihood and consequence and risk scores with everything. But they do provide a summary of the significance assessment. So that can act as that resilience assessment in some ways as well. So again, there's a lot of really good aspects in here. It also demonstrates how things have evolved since this initial assessment. And it's just an interesting disconnect between what's put in one section and another in terms of how climate is considered. So looking at key messages for climate change needs to be considered during early engagement and effects assessment. So those are the 2 areas we need to talk about it. There is, again, guidance provided by jurisdiction. So BC has some guidance, Ontario has some guidance. In general, it's all about the same. There's just some different terminology and sometimes some nuances you have to watch. Disciplines do need their climate information to complete their effects assessments. So sometimes it's great if you can just provide one-stop shopping and develop a climate data set to support the environmental assessment. And this, again, if you're going to do that, should involve input from all disciplines, and transparent documentation is key. So just from discussions with Environment Canada through my own environmental assessment reviews, they are sometimes less concerned with decisions made around scenarios, as long as you can transparently document them and provide the justification. And that's what's interesting when you're talking about climate science, is the future is unknown. So you do have to make as much effort as you can to justify decisions around how you're assessing it. There are multiple guidance documents available for climate resilience, and they all center around a very similar approach. And And anything you've done with climate resilience inside of an effects assessment can be integrated into existing and planned risk management policies and programs using a decision-making framework. And this is a great way to take all of the great work that's been done in environmental assessment and bring it outside into the next stages of the process. So that's what I have for now. And I wanted to stop and ask if anybody had any questions.